I welcome you all to the module 1 of the course titled Foundations of Psychology, Concepts and Applications. So, this is the second lecture of the module 1. So, the module 1 is about the science of psychology. So, we are basically introducing the discipline of psychology. So, the first lecture was about the background and historical background of the psychology as a discipline, and today's lecture will be focusing on some of the basic or major aspects of the research methods associated with psychology as a discipline. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture, which was also part of the same module. So, in the last lecture, we defined psychology, how the concept of psychology evolved over time. We have tried to see how the meaning of the word psychology evolved. We also discussed the contemporary scope of psychology. So, with the evolution of the term, how psychology is understood in the present context. What are the scope of psychology, what are the length and breadth of psychology in terms of understanding and the content. We also discussed the goals of psychology. We also discussed there are 4 main goals of psychology, and how these goals connect to understanding human behavior from the different angles and so on, like describing, predicting, explaining, controlling and so on. We also discussed origin and brief history of psychology through the lens of various schools of thoughts that evolved over time, and how the whole study matter or the subject matter of psychology changed from time to time, and how then it relates to the present state of research that we see in the discipline of psychology. And obviously, at the end we discussed the contemporary perspectives, how these different schools of thought that led to the contribution of psychology, and what is the present status, what are the new things that emerge and so on. So, this is how we gave the background of psychology in the last class through the lens of history and so on. Today's lecture will be focusing on some of the major aspects of research method, because research method is a vast area. We cannot cover everything in one lecture, but we will just focus on some of the major aspects that we need to understand when we think about doing research in psychology. So, we will talk about key characteristics of the scientific method. We will also talk about what are the steps in scientific research. We will also discuss the different research methods or approaches that are used in psychology. We will also briefly see how data are analyzed in psychology, and at the end we will talk about what are the ethical issues that we need to be careful while doing research with humans, because we deal with humans predominantly in the psychology. So, there are many ethical issues that we need to take care of. So, this will give a just a kind of broad overview of the major aspects of research methods in psychology. It will be a kind of focusing on the major aspects only. So, let us start. So, as we discussed in the last class while defining psychology, that psychology is a scientific study or it is a science. So, psychology claims to be a science or it claims to use scientific method, and we try to see what are the hallmarks of scientific method, what are the characteristics that are required to be called any inquiry as science or any discipline as science. We will just elaborate on that little bit more in today's lecture, because research method is basically defined by what is your background assumptions behind the research. So, if you are assuming that you are using scientific method, then those assumptions behind scientific method has to be fulfilled. So, the first thing, as we discuss, psychology is a science or it uses scientific method. What does that mean? Okay. Let us elaborate little bit more today. So, psychology uses a scientific method that we discussed in the last lecture. So, in the scientific method, when we talk about any scientific method, knowledge is acquired through systematic observation, measurement and analysis. So, there is a systematic observation, there is a systematic process step by step, then there is a proper measurement of it and then proper analysis of it, then there is a conclusion. So, in any scientific inquiry, findings are based on evidence, not based on beliefs and opinions. So, that is how a layman is different from a scientist. Layman makes opinion just based on few selective observation, okay? And they will make certain opinions and beliefs which may be true, may not be true. It is just based on certain selective observation. Now, science never makes such kind of conclusions. It always make conclusion based on systematic observation and evidences. So, when we talk about scientific method, we are talking about certain assumptions behind in the inquiry that you are doing or behind the research that you are engaged in. So, scientific method refers to certain kind of set of assumptions that we will talk about. It also talks about certain attitudes that you take. It also includes the procedure or steps that are followed, and all these guides researcher in the process of scientific inquiry. Okay. So, whenever you are claiming that you are using scientific method, you have to follow certain assumptions, certain attitudes, certain procedures. Now, what are these? We will just a little bit elaborate. We briefly touched upon yesterday in the last lecture. Today, we will kind of elaborate little bit more on that. So, what are the key characteristics of the scientific method? So, scientific method has several core features which ensures that the knowledge that we are acquiring or the data that we are getting is reliable, it is objective and evidence based. So, the first characteristics is that scientific method focuses on empirical evidence. Empirical evidence basically means it relies on measurable and observable evidence. So, empirical as I have discussed in the last lecture, the concept of empiricism comes from the idea that the scientists or people who are using scientific method, they rely on data that can be detected through sense organs. And then those data that are coming from through sense organ like eyes, like seeing, hearing, touching, tasting and so on, because if you cannot detect something through your sense organ, then it does not exist for us. This world exists because we are able to detect it through our sense organs. If our sense organ does not work, then this world does not exist for us. We are hearing, we are seeing, we are touching, we are testing, that is why we are able to conclude that there is a world out there and there are matters out there and and all these things. So, all the data that we are getting about the outside world is only through our sense organs. There are no other ways to know about it. Obviously, the basic data comes from the sense organ, then you can process those information in your mind and make elaborate abstract conclusions about things. So, empirical evidence basically talks about you only rely on things on which can be detected and not just getting data randomly, but it has to be measurable, systematic and so on. So, there has to be observable evidence for it. So, the knowledge is based on data that we get through our sense organs. It should not be based on just opinions, beliefs and assumptions, then it is not scientific. If you are just seeing something and making some conclusions, this is a layman perspective. A scientist never makes conclusion like this, he will elaborately collect data and analyze and then make conclusion. So, it has to be measurable, whatever data is there, and it should be systematically observed and so on. So, the first is empirical evidence has to be there. Second is objectivity. Objectivity is about that you have to avoid personal biases, because we are human beings, we have many biases in our mind. So, when we do research also or when we engaged in scientific method of research, there is a possibility that your own personal biases may come in. So, as a good researcher or as a good scientist, you have to keep away all these personal biases from interfering in your interpretation or analysis of data or collection of data in the whole process of research. So, findings should be strictly based on data. So, these are the things that one has to follow to call yourself as scientist or that you are using scientific method and so on. Conclusions are independent of personal interpretation. So, conclusions are based on data that you are getting, not based on just your own interpretation. So, for example, objectivity means what? For example, you are testing a new teaching method and you want to see whether this teaching method is effective for student or not. Let us say this is just an hypothesis that you are trying to test out. You develop certain style of teaching and you want to see whether it is effective or not. Now, when you say based on 1 or 2 class using those method, you just say I think this method is effective based on whatever you feel from the class, then this is a subjective kind of, still you are not using scientific method for making conclusion, it's still very subjective based on what you perceive. But when you actually collect data from the student, then you find out that students scored on an average 75% after using this method, whatever method you are using, compared to earlier they used to score let us say 60% on an average. Then you have a measurable database conclusion you are making that whether it is more effective or not. So, this is how subjective interpretation differ from objective interpretation based on data. So, that is the meaning of objectivity. So, this is another criteria of scientific method. Third is replicability. So, the result should be repeatable, then only we can verify it, otherwise there is no way to verify. Just based on one person's or one scientist's research, you cannot make a theory out of it. When many other people follow the same process and they also find the same result, then we can say it is a replicable result and everybody is finding similar findings, then we can be confident that there is a truth in this finding, because one person can make mistakes, but 10%, 20% doing the same thing and finding same thing, then we are more confident that there is a truth in the research. So, other researchers using the same procedure should also obtain similar result, then only it is replicable. It ensures reliability of scientific findings. So, that is why people publish research in journals, so that other can also replicate the findings and find out problems in the research and so on. That is the whole point of publishing research, so that you can test out the replicability of the research. So, this is another important criteria of scientific method. Related to those testability, another concept which calls falsifiability, it is kind of connected to the replicability only. So, falsifiability means scientific method hypothesis must be testable. What is the meaning of something is testable? You can use certain process and test it out. So, that is the meaning of testable. No? Now, it should be framed in such a way that it can be proven wrong and also proven correct also. Okay? So, then that is the meaning of falsifiability. I can also prove it wrong. If I follow certain process and I do not find the expected result that the earlier researcher mentioned, then it is proven wrong. So, there has to be inbuilt assumption in the testability is that if something is testable means I can also prove it wrong. So, that is the whole idea behind falsifiability. So, evidence can support or contradict a hypothesis. So, when you make a hypothesis, there is two possibilities, either the hypothesis is correct or it is incorrect based on the evidence. So, if I can prove it wrong or incorrect, then it is falsifiable. So, scientific hypotheses or concepts should be also falsifiable. That is the meaning of testability, another way of saying it. So, if something cannot be tested or proven wrong, then it is not scientific. If there is no way to prove it wrong or there is no way to test it out, then it is not scientific. So, there can be many claims which you cannot test because you cannot find data for it, then it is not scientific. For example, a student, let us say this is a hypothesis, a student who sleep 8 hours will score higher on memory test, let us say. So, student who regularly sleep, let us say for 8 hours, I am making a hypothesis that their memory will function better, let us say this is a hypothesis. Now, it should be testable or it should be proven wrong also, then it is scientific hypothesis. So, in this hypothesis we can measure sleep hours, we can conduct memory test, we can compare scores for the student who sleep less and who student sleep more and so on. If the result shows no difference, then the statement is false. If I find student who sleep less than 8 hours also equally scoring with the students who sleep 8 hours, then I can say this is not a true statement or this hypothesis is not correct. So, I can prove it wrong, it is inbuilt in it. So, that is the meaning of falsifiability. So, scientific concepts and hypotheses are also falsifiable simply because they can be tested out. Then systematic observation and experiment, that is also a very basic concept. Research should follow ordered and methodical steps. So, for every experiment that is done, every research that is done, there are steps should be followed. We will discuss the steps in the next concept only. So, there has to be ordered systematic steps that should be followed, then only you can make a proper conclusion. Otherwise, if we do some random observation and make some conclusion, because we are not following proper steps, then those conclusion may be wrong. So, procedures has to be planned, logical, not random or haphazard. So, that is very important. For example, when we talk about human behavior, people make so many wrong assumptions, so many wrong conclusions about other people simply because of random observation. Let us say I go to a shop and there is a salesman and he behaves rudely with me, let us say. Immediately there will be a tendency to conclude that this person is a very bad person or very rude person. Now, what are you doing? You are making a conclusion based on just one evidence. You have not seen that person in so many other instances. You have not seen the person behaving many times in the shop and so on. It is possible that in that day there is something wrong in his mood or something wrong has happened in his life. So, his mood is not right. So, maybe because that has triggered that wrong behavior. So, making such conclusion could be erroneous, but let us say every day you are going and the person is behaving very similar. So, you have a large set of data, now you can make more confident conclusion that the person has, there is some kind of issue in terms of behaviors or anger issues with that person. So, this conclusion you can make only when you have multiple observation or systematic observation you made and you have data for that person's behavior in a particular context. So, that is how random observation can lead to many wrong conclusions. So, that is avoided by systematic observation. Scientific method also requires you to be maintain transparency and peer review, which is part of publication and so on. So, transparency means methods and results should be openly shared. So, that is how what is done in publications. You openly share what are the processes you have followed, what are the steps you have followed, what are the what was your sample, how you have selected people, what are the analysis you have done, and how you have concluded something. So, every steps are given in the publication and so on. So, the idea is that if someone else is interested can follow the same state and see whether this is true or not. So, findings are then examined by scientific community when it is published. It allows validation, critique, improvement and so on. This is how knowledge grows and improves. So, this is called transparency and peer review. Another important factor is predictability. Scientific reasoning allows identification of patterns. If you know the patterns of certain behavior or certain kind of phenomena, you can make prediction. If this is what is happening, it is more likely to happen tomorrow also. So, that is the predictability part of it. Prediction of future outcomes. Predictions are based on established evidence. So, if you have established evidence, you can make certain conclusion that we discussed in the last lecture also. Scientific method also is there is an automatic self correction method is also involved in it. So, scientific knowledge, no knowledge is final and absolute, particularly when we talk about human behavior or social sciences. You cannot make an absolute statement, okay, this is the final truth. Scientific knowledge, most of this knowledge these are like, there is an work in progress, you make amendments and better conclusion based on the available evidences and so on. The newer evidences you get makes your conclusions also little bit, according to the data and so on. So, it is a continuously revised, updated kind of knowledge structure. New evidence or better methods can change conclusion and so on. Okay. So, there is a continuous evolution of knowledge, particularly when we talk about social sciences or discipline like psychology and so on. We do not make absolute statements like this is the final truth and so on. No? Newer evidences can change the truth or change the direction of the truth also. So, this is the meaning of self correction. So, scientific knowledges are like this, there is a sense of self correction in it, which leads to evolution of knowledge, refinement of knowledge and so on. So, these are some of the major characteristics or hallmarks of scientific method, and psychology as a discipline tries its best to follow those scientific method, the principles of scientific method, so that they get more objective true knowledge, and based on that they can make generalization about the understanding and so on. Obviously, lot of this is not easy to maintain in behavioral research or when you are dealing with human beings. For example, maintaining objectivity may not be so easy when you are dealing with human subjects, because the presence of human subject, other person will change automatically, the response will change. So, it is not so easy. Also there are many ways to minimize those, but still maintaining objectivity and lot of these things may not be easy when we are talking about dealing with human subjects and so on. It is much more easy when you are doing with, let us say, studying a piece of rock in a natural sciences, because rock is not going to change because you are present here. So, there are certain challenges involved in social sciences, but at least the idea is that you maintain to the best of the capability to minimize all these errors and maintain the scientific standard. So, scientific method has certain steps to be followed when you do research. So, broadly 4 steps should be followed when you do any research in psychology, let us say, or in any scientific method. So, there are broadly 4 major steps that should be followed. So, what are those steps? Step 1 is that you start with developing a research question. The first thing is that you should have certain questions in your mind. Why do you want to do research? What do you want to do research? What are the questions that you are trying to address? What are the answers that you are seeking? So, that is research, you are trying to find some answers. You observe something, you see something in the literature, whatever it is, the source of research question could be anything, but you have certain question in your mind and you want to get answer. So, those questions are research questions. Before doing any research, you should have certain research question, that is the fundamental requirement. So, psychologists formulate research question based on so many sources. Okay? They can be based on some theories. So, you study a theory and you see this theory is making this prediction or this hypothesis. So, let me test it out. Okay? You can get certain questions from the theories. Based on some observation in day to day life, you see why people behave like this, let me find out. So, this may be a research question. Okay. From your experience also you can sometimes develop research questions. From common beliefs also you can find certain research questions. The source of research question could be many, but the idea is to do research, first you have to have some questions in your mind. Okay. Those are called research questions. For example, I will give one examples from very classic research in psychology. It was done by Albert Bandura and this is called as Bobo doll experiment. It was done in 1961, Bobo doll experiment. That experiment was one of the foundational research that led to social learning theory, observational learning and so on. So, those whole concept and theories developed out of it. So, we will see this 4 step through that experiment, particular experiment. So, let us say in this Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. So, first you have a research question. What was the research question? Do children learn aggressive behavior by observing adults? So, that was the question. Bandura was interested that whether children learn aggressive behavior by observing adults. When adults behave in aggressive way, do also children learn by looking at them, observing their behavior. So, that was the question that he was interested in. So, this is the first step, you have a research question. Now, the next step is framing those questions as hypotheses. Now, you may have many broad research questions, but then you convert those research questions into testable statements, so that I can test it out more specific measurable way. So, hypothesis is a testable prediction. Now, you frame those research questions in such a way that they can be tested out. So, again hypothesis can be derived from theories, previous research, common assumptions also and so on. For example, in the earlier Bobo doll experiment, what was the hypothesis? Bandura made hypothesis that children who observe an adult behaving aggressively towards a doll will imitate those aggressive behavior. So, that means that was the hypothesis. He gave a direction. Now you need to test it out those hypotheses. He said the children who observes other adults behaving aggressively, they are more likely to imitate those aggressive behavior. So, that was the hypothesis, the prediction they make, and now they can test it out. What is this prediction? Whether this prediction is true or not, that the result will tell. So, this is the second step. The third step is, now you have research question, now you have hypothesis. Now, the next thing is that you have to find data for it to see whether this hypothesis is true or not. So, the third step is gathering evidence. So, research design methods to collect, researcher designs some different ways of collecting data based on research question. So, they frame certain steps to follow and participants to be selected, and then data has to be collected. Certain procedures are followed, chosen to directly test the hypothesis and so on. What should be the process of data collection and so on. So, that is the part of gathering evidence. For example, in the earlier example of Bobo doll experiment, how they collected data? Children were divided into 2 groups. Children were divided into different groups. One group watched an adult hit, kick and shout at a Bobo doll. So, that Bobo doll means these are life size dolls, big dolls. So, there was a video clip of were shown to one group of children. What they observed, that the clip was an adult was hitting, kicking and shouting at a doll. So, they were just behaving aggressively towards a doll. So, that was the video clip that was shown to one group of children. Another group watched a non-aggressive adults. They just watched that another group of children, they also see the similar kind of video clips, but again here the adult was not behaving aggressively with the doll. It was just playing with it and maybe something like that, And there was a control group, another group who saw no model. They did not see any such kind of model doing anything. So, it was control group. So, one group sees aggressive behavior, another sees no aggression. The third group, there was no context of, so that was just a control group. So, afterwards they placed children alone in a room with the same Bobo doll. Control group had no model behaving in any particular way. So, that was the control group. After that, these children who observed these video clips, different clips, this group of children, all these groups of children were put alone with the same doll in a different room, and they were looking at how these children behaves now, because they have seen certain models behaving in certain ways. What was measured here? Number of aggressive acts done by those children, imitation of specific aggressive words and behaviors, physical aggression towards the doll. This provided objective behavioral data. So, when they were put alone with those dolls, they see what is the impact of their looking at another model behaving in certain ways, either aggressively or non-aggressively, how it impacted the behavior of the children when they are put alone with the same doll. So, they are measuring their aggressive acts and so on. So, this is how data is collected. So, they are measuring aggressive acts in terms of whether they are shouting, kicking, punching those aggressive dolls or not. So, that was the data. The step 4, once you have a data, now you can make conclusion based on analysis of that data. So, drawing conclusion. Now, data are analyzed using, if depending on what kind of data you have. So, if you have different numbers data in numerical form, you can use statistics to analyze. So, researcher determines relationship, whether there is a relationship exists, group differences are statistically significant or not. Result must be unlikely due to chance. So, result should not be like there is a difference, but it may be because of just chance factor. You should remove those chance factor and there has to be significant chance that result is there. Then only you can make conclusion. So, statistics are used to make conclusion whether it is real difference or it is just by chance this difference has happened. So, in our earlier example, when they analyzed data, they found the children who observed aggressive adults in the clip, they behave more aggressively in terms of all these actions and verbal behavior. They even copied specific actions and phrases used by the model, significantly higher than the other group of children who did not see such aggression. So, it was very clear that when they observed adult models behaving aggressively, they also imitated the same behavior. And so, the conclusion, that was the conclusion they found, that children can learn aggressive behavior through observation and imitation even without direct reinforcement or reward. They were not rewarded for anything, just observing someone they can behave in a certain ways. And this became a foundation for social learning theory, observational learning and so on later on. So, this is just an example how research is done. So, that was the step how you draw conclusion and analyze the data and so on. So, these are the 4 steps that are followed in research. Now, how do psychologists conduct research? Step by step we have seen. Now, what are the different approaches or methodologies that researcher can use in the field of psychology to address or find out their research questions or answer their research questions? Typically, there are many methodologies, many methods are used. Broadly, we can say research could be quantitative, research can be qualitative. Now, in quantitative research, basically data comes in the forms of number. So, you collect data in terms of numbers and numericals. Okay. So, for example, in the earlier cases, you can see the number of aggression acts. Let us say how many times a child punches the doll. So, that you can find the numbers. So, the data is coming in the form of numbers. So, such kind of research where you collect data in terms of numbers and numericals, then you use statistics to analyze, those are called typically quantitative research. In qualitative research, the data typically comes from subjective reports. So, you take interviews, ask people their statements and the reports, like their subjective understanding of any concept of the participants becomes the data. So, these are called qualitative research, where statements of the people become the data, not the numbers. So, that is why these are called qualitative research. So, broadly we can have quantitative research, qualitative research. I will not go too much into those differences, and within the major dominant the research method is quantitative research in psychology. So, quantitative research again can be descriptive, it could be correlational, it could be experimental and so on. Let us go into these 3 major approaches to research: descriptive research, correlational research, experimental research, very briefly, so that we understand based on what kind of research questions you have, you can use one of this method. So, descriptive research, as the name suggests, it is generally a first step in research. If you want to in the beginning want to understand what is going on in something, so descriptive research is very good, just to explore what is happening. So, that is the typical descriptive research. It is generally first step in research for exploring new research topic, just to get sense ki what is going on in with certain population or sample. While personal observations and common sense ideas can be biased, descriptive method allows researcher to make careful and systematic observations. So, the researcher carefully and systematically observe certain phenomena and then they describe it. So, that is called descriptive research. So, generally if you do not know anything about any particular topic or a particular area of research, then descriptive research is a very good way to start with understanding a phenomena. So, the purpose of descriptive research is to describe behavior as it naturally occurs. You observe something as it happens and you just record it and then describe it. So, descriptive method helps psychologists to observe, record and describe behavior without manipulating variables. You do not manipulate anything, you just record it, what is happening there, observe it and then describe it. So, descriptive methods are conducted mostly in the real world setting. Wherever the things are happening as it is, you just go and observe it and accurately record it. Behavior is studied as it naturally occurs, reduces reliance on personal opinions and assumptions. You do not have to put your personal opinions and assumptions. The way it is happening, you just record it. So, that is called descriptive research. These are very useful in understanding prevalence rate of something, association between variables and so on also. That is also done in the correlational research also. It also helps you to give a sense of association between variables. It also determines how common certain behaviors or traits are. This is called prevalent rate, prevalence rate. So, if you want to see what is the prevalence rate of let us say depression among a particular population. Let us say out of 100 how many people generally feel depressed and or they are patients of depression. So, these are called prevalence rate in a population. So, descriptive research are very good in terms of finding out those prevalence rate. Descriptive research also help you to develop hypothesis, because you observe something and you say that it is likely that this is going to happen. Before you further go into more complicated or more advanced form of research, descriptive research help you to give some basic sense of what should be the direction of hypothesis. So, scientifically gathered observations provide strong foundation, help researcher develop hypothesis, guide further systematic research. So, generally descriptive research is generally the first step for a lot of researches. It gives you basic understanding of the phenomena. Now, in descriptive there can be different specific methods for data collection. It may include things like case studies, naturalistic observation and surveys. This all can be used for descriptive research. So, very briefly let us see all these specific methods that are used for descriptive research. Now, case studies are basically is an in-depth study of particular cases, typically longitudinal examination. So, you spend some time, maybe months and years on a particular group of people or maybe one individual or a particular organization, whatever the unit is, you spend some time on a particular case and then observe and collect data and then make conclusion about that particular case. So, that is why this is called case study. Now, it could be a case study on a person, particular one person, it could be one group of individual or a society or a community, or it could be a specific event or organization, whatever it is. So, the unit could be different based on what you are aiming to do. So, the researcher gather data through interviews, direct observation, archival records to understand complex issues that can be replicated in lab, because you cannot do research in laboratory with human beings all the time. So, you can collect data through various sources like through interviewing people by direct observation. You can also collect archival records to understand complex issues in a particular case. So, that is typically done in case studies. Case studies is best for studying rare phenomena. For example, what happens when there is a brain injury in someone or when a particular part of the brain gets damaged. So, let us say somebody by accident certain brain damages happen. So, one can use it as a case study. In medical science, lot of such case studies are used to understand what is the possibility when something happens or some kind of damage happens in certain part of the body or brain. So, these are typically done through case studies for generating new hypothesis. What is the upside of it? It provides incredibly rich detailed information that many other method might miss, because you are studying a particular case in detail. So, you can get very rich information. Okay. So, that is the positive side of it. What are the downsides of it? you cannot generalize findings. So, that is one problem with the case studies, because you are studying only particular one or two cases. So, you cannot generalize that it will be true for everyone else, not necessary. So, generalization becomes problematic in case studies. One of the very notable examples of case studies in neuroscience and psychology is the case study of a patient named H.M. Henry Molaison. In short, he is called as H.M. as a patient. He is a very classic and a very celebrated case study in neuroscience and so on. So, this H.M. patient underwent a brain surgery in 1953. The surgery was done to control his seizure. So, certain seizure symptoms were there, and doctor performed a brain surgery to control that. Now, that resulted in control of his seizure, but there was a side effect of that surgery. What was the side effect? That the patient lost the different aspects of his memory. His memory got lost because of that surgery, because they had to remove certain part from the brain. So, this surgery removed what specific parts of the brain, particularly the hippocampus and some parts of medial temporal lobes, certain part from the brain. Now, with that operation, seizure improved, his symptoms of seizure improved, but what happens? But some unexpected thing happened which doctors did not expect. After the operation, this patient developed severe anterograde amnesia, means he could not form any new memories, new long term memories he cannot form. So, that means he could not remember new people he met, he forgot conversations within a few minutes, each day felt almost new to him, because he could not remember, he cannot form new memories. Old memories were there, but new memories he cannot form. However, he remembered events from childhood, his intelligence remained normal, his short term memory was also normal. So, whatever already memory were there, they were there, but he could not form any further new memories. So, this is a classic case how certain parts of the brain is responsible for memory, So, that led to many insights in how brain is related to memory functions and so on. So, this is a classic case of case study and how it led to so many rich information. So, this case spanned over 50 years, through which psychologists learned extensively about memory formation, brain structures, what are the structures involved and so on. Even after his death, his preserved brain continues to be studied. His brain was preserved after his death, and it became a classic case study to understand that. Then comes, so these are different methods of descriptive research. One was case study. Now, next is naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation, by name it suggests that you just observe things as it is happening in the nature, in the natural environment, without interference from the researcher. So, researcher will not interfere. Think of a primatologist, means typically people who do research in primates like monkeys and so on, chimpanzees, they are watching chimps in the wild, or a developmental psychologist observing children on a playground through one-way mirror. So, let us say somebody is interested in children behavior, they are observing children in their natural environment without interfering. So, that is a naturalistic observation and collecting data. So, these are best for seeing how subjects behave when they do not think they are being watched. So, the best is that because they are not even conscious they are being watched. So, they behave very naturally. So, you get the best exact behavior as compared to when you go and ask people, because they become conscious, they can change their behavior. So, in naturalistic observation you get a very natural sample of behavior. What is the upside of it? It is a high ecological validity. The behavior is spontaneous and real, not forced by lab setting. Very natural behavior you will get, and more accurate observation you will get. So, real life data you will get it. The problem with this kind of observation is, this kind of method is, researcher have no control over what is happening. You cannot control. If the behavior you want to see does not happen, you are out of luck. You want to see particular kind of behavior among children, but they are not showing those behavior today, you cannot do anything about it. You have to wait maybe 5 days, you are not seeing the same behavior. So, you have to wait again for few days. So, that is, you do not have control over what is happening in the natural world. So, that is one problem with it, and also there may be observer bias. The researcher is a person, he may be also biased even in observing that also. So, it is difficult to control some of these things. One of the classic examples of naturalistic observation was done by Jane Goodall's long term study of chimpanzees in Gombe National Park, Tanzania. So, he understand the behavior of chimpanzees by naturalistic observation, he found so many newer insights about the behavior of chimpanzees through this naturalistic observation. Then comes surveys. The third method under descriptive research is that here survey involve asking large group of people on a standardized set of questions about their attitudes, beliefs and behaviors. Now, you ask certain questions in a questionnaire about their attitudes, beliefs, behaviors from a large set of people. So, that is called survey. You get data from large set of people. This can be conducted directly by giving paper or in the digital form or through interviews also. So, these are best for gathering huge amount of data quickly and checking for correlation across broad population. So, the best part of it is that quickly you can get large number of data from large section of people at a time. So, it is very cost effective and efficient. If one uses a very representative sample, means very accurate sample which represent the population, then you can make pretty good and accurate conclusion about population based on small sample of study. And lot of these studies involve such kind of surveys from the sample based and then generalize it to the population. The downside of it is that people are not always honest. So, when you ask people, they may not always give honest answer. So, there is a possibility of social desirability bias when people participant give only correct answer which they think is a desirable answer rather than what are they actually. So, there is a possibility of not giving the honest answer. So, that could be the downside of it. For example, survey on a violent video games, one of the research that was done, for example, a survey of it included a 374 participant. They were asked about playing video games. Participant rated 20 motives why they play video games on a 5-point scale using third person phrasing. People play, for example, people play violent video games because whatever reason they can write reasons to reduce biases from social desirability. If they ask why you play, then they may not give accurate answers. So, they use third person phrasing. So, this is how the biases are reduced in research. Result shows players most valued the fun and challenge aspect of violent video games, whereas their interest in the violent content itself was relatively low. So, like this, this is a survey that gave certain insight about certain phenomena. Then comes correlational method. Now, correlational method is basically the focus is to find relationship among variables. Variables means anything whose values can change. So, height is a variable because height can change. Somebody's height can be 5 feet, somebody's height can be 6 feet. So, it is a variable. So, when you want to see the relationship between two variables, then it is a correlation. You see the relationship between them. So, the focus of correlation method is to find what is the direction of relationship, is it positive, negative, or what is the strength of relationship. Is it a very strongly correlated or weakly correlated? So, variables include factors which can vary such as height, weight, these are all variables. Any concepts around which the values can change is a variable. Okay? For example, sleep is a variable, you can sleep more and less, the values of sleep can change. So, that is also a variable. So, psychology in research in psychology, we use the concept of variable and see in correlation research we try to see the relationship among those variables. For example, do sleep hours relate to students' grade? Let us say, does sleep has any connection with their grade? So, grade is one variable, sleep is one variable. So, you collect data on sleep, collect data on their grades and see is there any correlation. So, this is for example, a simple example of correlational research. For example, the study found no relationship between these two factors. So, that means sleep is not related with grades as such directly. Is parental age associated with autism spectrum disorder? Is, let us say, the age at which parents give birth to a child, does it have any connection with the likelihood of getting autistic child and so on, let us say. So, you are two variables and trying to see relationship and so on. So, like this correlational research try to see any relationship between them, between variables. How it works? Researcher measure each variables independently, they measure, collect data for both the variables and then see whether they are correlated statistically or not. How is it data is interpreted? If there is a positive correlation, that means high value in one is related to high value in other. So, positive correlation means if one increases, other also increases. For example, height and weight, if I say height and weight are positively correlated, that means with the increase of height, weight will also increase. So, these are positively correlated. Negative correlation means what? As one increases, other decreases. So, the pattern is opposite. So, that is called negative correlation. For example, higher alcohol consumption correlates with lower grades or GPAs or whatever, lower grades among students. The more you consume alcohol, the less likely you get higher score, let us say. So, these are negatively correlated. Zero correlation means there is no systematic relationship between these two variables. For example, no correlation between full moons and crime activity and so on. Let us say whether you have a full moon or no moon and the kind of crime happens in a city, there is no relationship. So, in dono mein there is no relationship between them. So, like this there can be different types of relationship, positive, negative, zero correlation and so on. Now, one thing we should remember, in correlation does not mean causation. So, if these two variables are related, that does not mean one is causing the other. These are just related. There may be third factor which is causing it. So, correlation does not mean causation, that is very important, we need to understand. So, there is a third variable problem is always there. For example, the link between violent video games and aggression, if there is a positive relationship between violent video games and aggression, it may not be that video game is directly causing the aggression, there can be third factor which is causing the behavior. For example, aggressive youth might simply be drawn to these video games. Maybe the youth, that person who is becoming violent by seeing the video game, it may not be because of the video game he is becoming violent. Maybe in the beginning the person was already violent. So, that individual personal characteristics may be the third factor which is causing it. So, correlation does not mean one factor is causing the other. So, this is called third variable problem, could influence the things and so on. So, despite this causation problem, correlations are highly valuable to get large sum of data and see the patterns among the large sample of people. So, typically in correlational research, phrases like related to, linked to, associated with are often indicate correlational research rather than experimental finding. So, this method helps identifying strength and direction of relationship among and interpret rather than directly finding the causality on it. The third method called experimental method, they focus on causality. What is the cause of one thing? Now, experimental methods are used typically to find causes behind any phenomena, which you cannot do through correlational research. So, experiments are like gold standard. These are the most powerful scientific method for drawing conclusion and finding causes in research, because here it is done in a control environment and there is a manipulation of variable, and you can see whether by changing one other is also changing in a control environment. So, that is one thing. So, researcher begin with a precise testable hypothesis. Here also, if I do this, then what will happen? So, very controlled environment, the researcher is trying to see the causation. So, in the core variables in the experimental study are independent variable. Independent variable means the factor that researcher is actively manipulating or changing. So, researcher is changing one variable and seeing if I change this, what happens to the other. So, the variable which is changed is independent variable. Dependent variable is the variable on which the effect of change is seen is a dependent variable, or it is called as an outcome variable. We will give examples, but these are the different kinds of variables that are there. So, there can be confounding variables also, like other factors which can influence in between them also. So, experimental tries to control those external variables or confounding variables. So, sometimes they try to control the external variables by using control group. They isolate the effects of independent variable. Experiments include a control group that experiences all condition except the specific manipulation. So, if you remember that Bobodor experiment, there was one experimental group, other was a control group. Means in the experimental group, the children, they were shown a video clip where an adult was punching or behaving aggressively with a doll. So, something was manipulated there. In control group, there was no such factors. So, they did not see any such aggressive behavior. So, in control group, other things will remain same, but that particular manipulation will be absent. So, one thing is they do control group in experimental group, and they also do a random assignment to control the external factors. When you specifically select these people to go here and there, then you can make some group may be biased, some group may have higher intelligence student and some group may have lower intelligence, because you are selecting them actively. So, in random assignment you do not select anything, randomly you choose who will go to which group. So, then participants are randomly assigned to groups to minimize those confounding variables, individual differences and so on. Irrelevant factor like personality differences that could distort result are generally cancelled out in random assignment. Then experiments are done in a very controlled condition. conducted under very specific conditions in laboratory and so on. So that you are able to control lot of situations. That is why cause and effect can be very clearly seen in experiments. Some experiments are also called quasi experiments, when random assignments of participants are not possible, simply because these groups are already there, you cannot break them and change them. So there are all the other conditions of experiments are there, but you cannot do random assignments in terms of who will go to which group. For example, if you want to see the impact of a natural disaster on stress and anxiety, let us say after flood, researcher compare a students from flood affected districts versus students from unaffected districts. Now, you cannot change this. Students who are affected, they are affected. You cannot change them randomly, say ki you go to affected group, you go to unaffected group. You cannot divide it, because those who are affected, they are affected, is a natural group. So, these are called quasi experimental, because the groups are already formed. You cannot randomly assign people to go to this group or that group. So, these are not true experiment, but still other factors are seen, but you cannot randomly assign participant to different groups. So, for example, just to give you an example of a typical experiment, violent video games and aggression, one experiment was done. Participants were randomly assigned to play either violent video games. So, this is experimental group where certain conditions were already implemented. So, the here participant could see violent video games, they can play violent video games, and another group they are playing, but non-violent games, normal games. Okay. So, this is like a control group and this is like an experimental group. Measurement, how it is done? Aggression was measured by how long and loud participants set a noise blast to punish an opponent in a reaction time task. So, their aggression was measured using reaction time and what kind of blast they do in the game and so on. So, they have certain specific parameters. How environment was controlled? So, controlling all the other factors. Laboratory conditions were strictly controlled to minimize external factor known to affect aggression, because they are measuring aggression. Anything else that can that affect aggressions were removed, like room temperature. Because whenever some temperature goes up, people become aggressive. So, they control the room temperature, because room temperature can control the aggression. So, like this in experiment you can control everything. So, external factors. So, these are confounding factors which can influence what you are trying to measure, they are controlled. For example, in this case temperature. The results, findings showed that playing violent video games led to increased aggressive behavior as measured by noise, intensity and duration. So, then very conclusively they could make conclusion, because they could see those who are actually playing and those who are not playing violent video games, how it is affecting their behavior in a very controlled environment. So, you can find out the causes very clearly here, because everything is controlled. You can say now this change is happening only because of this video game, because there is no other factor here. So, therefore, causation can be very clearly, you can find out the causes behind factors in experiments much more clearly, which you cannot see in a correlational design or a descriptive research and so on. However, experiments have their own limitation also. There are certain ethical constraints. You cannot do experiment in every condition, because there are ethical issues. For example, you cannot experimentally induce trauma or injury to somebody to see the effect of injury on something. You cannot do that. You have to find people in the natural setup. Okay? So, like this, so there are certain limitations to that. Then, because of the artificiality of the laboratory conditions, sometimes it become very artificial and may not mimic the real life situation, because people sometimes change behavior because of the artificial condition. So, that can reduce the generalizability also. So, these are also limitations, because every method has their pros and cons. So, limited generalizability is one major issue in the real world setup, because it is done in an artificial condition. There are practical limitations also. Experiments could be very time consuming, resource consuming. You need a laboratory, instruments and so on. It may be very resourceful thing which may not be possible in many contexts, and in a large scale study it may not be possible. So, if you see descriptive research, the main question is what is happening, they will just describe it. Correlational, are variables related to each other, what is the relationship, what is the strength of relationship. Experimental, what causes what is the causes behind it. So, these are the things that are focused in each of these research methods. Now, let us very briefly talk about the data analysis, how it is done. So, now you have different, you have collected data from different methods. Now, once you have all the data, then you need to analyze them. So, typically in the quantitative research, analysis are done through statistics. In qualitative research, there are different ways of doing data analysis, which is beyond the purview of this today's lecture. So, qualitative research also, the subjective narratives are analyzed, thematic analysis are done and so on. I will not go into that part, but in the numerical or quantitative data, typical some of the statistics are used to make conclusions. So, once you have data, then you need to interpret that data by analyzing. So, once you have data, typically in qualitative, interview, transcript, observation, that are analyzed in different ways. In quantitative, test scores, survey rating, reaction times, these all are numerical scores, they are statistically calculated. So, data are then organized first in a spreadsheet or a software, whatever it is, and nowadays a lot of softwares are there which can automatically do the analysis and so on. Before doing analysis, one needs to clean the data, where researcher check for errors, missing values, outliers and so on. If some data are very extreme scores, you need to remove them, because this is not typical of everyone. If everybody is scoring, let us say scoring 10 in a particular measure and someone scored 50. Now, this is a very different case. If you put that data with that, it will skew the whole result. So, those are called outliers and they should be removed and so on. So, these are a part of preparation of data. So, once you prepare the data, and you can use descriptive statistics to summarize the data first. So, descriptive statistics summarizes the data using central tendencies like mean, finding average, median, middle value, mode, most common values and so on. So, these are all descriptive statistics to kind of summarize the data. So, you have 100 data, then you see the average score, what is the average score of this 100 data. So, that is descriptive statistics, that is called finding mean values. You can also see the dispersion or the range, what is the lowest score, what is the highest score, what is the range of this score, what is the range of age group in your sample, who is the youngest sample and who is the oldest sample. So, these are all range measure of dispersion, variance, standard deviation, how it is spread out from the mean value and so on. All these measures are used to get some sense of descriptive data, like you summarize what is the patterns in the data. You can use graphs to visualize data, charts, histograms and so on also. Now, descriptive data is only good for describing the data, as I said, but if you want to make hypothesis testing and go beyond just describing and make conclusions, generalize it to the larger sample, then you need inferential statistics. Inferential statistics, there are different tests for different purposes. For example, common tests like t-tests are used to compare average between two groups. So, if you want to find the difference between two groups, let us say whether males are different from females in a particular score, then you need to do t-test and find out whether they are significantly different from each other, let us say on, let us say any score, let us say leadership. You have a sample of data with males and females and you want to see whether females and males are different in their leadership styles. So, you need to do t-test to find out whether they are different or not. ANOVA is done when you have more than two groups. Okay. Now, here only males, females, let us say there you have one more groups, or let us say age groups, you have 3 age groups. Then you need to do ANOVA as a test to find out whether these 3 groups are how they are different from each other. Correlational coefficients are done to find relationship, as I already discussed in correlational research. You see the relationship among variables. So, correlation coefficient you find out and it will give you strength of relationship, direction of relationship and so on. So, this is called for example, Pearson R is a correlation coefficient. Then regression analysis are done to predict predict the value of one variable from other variables. So, this is for prediction outcome. So, you want to predict whether one variable can lead to other variables and so on. So, it is based on correlation only, but then you do further analysis to make predictions. Like this, there could be many statistical tests that can be used to make inference and test or to test out hypothesis and so on. So, these are all different kinds of statistics, and in statistics this is probability is used to make conclusions. So, you have to find out in statistics whether these are just possibly by chance or there is a significant difference existing in the data. So, that statistical significance is used, where p value less than 0.05 is typically accepted. That means this is very high chance that 95% chance that this is actually happening and 5% chance could be just errors. So, that is acceptable, like this, the different parameters are used. So, this is how hypothesis tests are there. So, the last topic is on ethics in research. So, when you do research, you need to take care of certain ethical issues. You cannot just go and collect data from people and so on. So, certain ethical issues has to be taken care of. So, especially when you are dealing with human beings, So, some of the ethical issues that need to be taken care is protection from harm. You have to ensure that when you are collecting data from people, they are not harmed either physically or mentally. That is very important. So, researcher must ensure participants are not exposed to unnecessary physical or psychological harms. Psychological harm though means because of your questions, they should not be traumatized or they should not be full of anxiety because you ask something very uncomfortable. So, you have to take care of that. Any potential risk must be minimized and justified. If there is any risk, you have to justify why you need to put those people in those risks. Does it has scientific potential much more than the risk involved? If a study could distress emotionally, mentally, physically, researcher must take step to reduce this and provide necessary support. First, you should avoid if there is any possibility of distress, but in case it happens unknowingly or knowingly, then you have to take necessary step to reduce them and so on. Second is informed consent. Participants should be fully informed about what is the nature, what is the purpose, what is the process involved in the research and what is the benefit they may get. Consent has to, the participant has to give consent voluntarily. They should say I am willing to participate and so on, and typically it should be taken in written form. Special care should be taken with vulnerable groups like children, patients, people with certain disabilities. If they are not able to give consent, their caretaker has to give the consent. Participant must know whether that they can withdraw at any time. Before completing the research also they can withdraw, you have to allow that. So, that is called informed consent. Confidentiality and anonymity has to be maintained throughout the research. No personal information should be disclosed in the research writing or report writing or thesis writing, whatever it is. Everything, the name, identity should be kept confidential. When reporting results, researcher must ensure that individual cannot be identified, protecting their privacy and identity and so on. Data should be securely stored and used only as stated in the research purpose. So, you should secure the data so that it should not go to someone else and misuse that. So, that is also very important ethical issue. Sometimes in psychological research people use deception, means they cannot directly say what they are doing, because if they say, the participant will change their behavior. So, there is a problem here. So, sometimes they use deception, means they will say they are doing something, but actually they are doing something else. So, this is called deception. It is also generally not allowed, but in case it is really required to do that, it should be done only when it is absolutely necessary and no significant harm should be done because of this deception. Participant must be debriefed after the research. So, as soon as possible after the participation, they should be debriefed that why you use the deception and what was the requirement, and if any impact was there, you should minimize that. Ethical review board must approve any such deception before you can implement them and so on. From wherever you are doing research, some ethical review committee has to be there, they should approve that. So, debriefing is done generally generally it should be done in most of the cases, but especially when deceptions are done. Means participant has to be, you have to explain them, study and answer questions and any misconception they have, so that they should not go with confusion and anxiety after the research. Participants should leave without feeling confused, stressed or hurt by the involvement in the research. So, sixth is right to withdraw. Participant can leave a study at any stage and request that their data should be withdrawn without negative consequence. If they want in the middle of the research, they do not want to participate, you should allow that. So, they should have the right to withdraw at any time. The right is emphasized during consent and debriefing. In the beginning, this should be told to them. Special consideration has to be done for vulnerable population like children, people with disability or vulnerable population, because they can be harmed much more easily, recognizing their limited capacity to consent. So, their caretaker has to be involved in it. Cross cultural research, if you are doing some very culture specific group of people, then one should be sensitive about their local norms values and laws preventing any cultural bias. So, you should not just impose your ideas on them. So, there can be many cultural norms and things which needs to be followed, you should be aware of that if you are doing some specific culture related research and so on. So, these are some of the ethical issues that one should take care of. There are many more also, but these are some of the major issues that need to be taken care if you are doing research with human participants. So, research has so many dimensions, you cannot just go and do research, you know. So, these are some of the broad understanding of how research are done in psychology. With this I stop here. Thank you.